Hi, I'm Dr. John Fagg. I teach at University of Birmingham in the School of English Drama and American and Canadian Studies. My research work focuses on early 20th century American culture. I'm particularly interested in the ways in which cultural forms and the work of artists and writers reflects or responds to, engages with processes of cultural and social change that we might broadly understand as being those of modernity. So the ways in which early 20th century America transforms through processes of urbanization, spread and emergence of new technologies, new forms of communication. So that's the kind of historical base that I work from. And I'm particularly interested in the ways in which earlier forms of culture get adapted or shifted, and older ways of producing or explaining things, older ways of representation get transformed in that new circumstance. So my first book was on the writer Stephen Crane and the painter George Bellows, and I was looking at the ways in which they might be positioned, as I referred to in the title, on the cusp of modernism or modernity, so that they kind of have a one foot in the 19th century, one foot in the 20th, that they kind of straddle those periods or moments. And I've continued that research focus on into more recent projects. So the book that I'm currently working on looks at the ways in which early 20th century American artists use the forms of genre painting, so the painting of everyday life that has a long history in European and American art, but to look at the changing processes of everyday life in 20th century America. In that way, I'm thinking about that kind of process of transition, and I'm particularly interested in the ways in which a form that had tended to be applied to rural life or to kind of small-scale scenes of domesticity starts to be refocused or repurposed in an urban setting. In that context, I'm also interested in the ways in which that art gets transferred into advertising and commercial imagery for the new mass market magazines, and that's a sort of a further interest that I have in thinking about periodical culture, print culture, the effect of mass market publication at the start of the 20th century. A final concern that kind of stems out of those interests is in particular with the representation of bodies in this period. Lots of the artists that I work on, so George Bellows being one example, John Sloan being another, are understood or have been understood or tend to be understood as realist artists of one kind or another, but I'm interested in the ways in which they're actually engaged in a kind of process of engagement with materiality, and particularly the materiality of the body. So that term realism starts to break down and be less useful than we might expect. In that regard, sort of pursuing that line of inquiry, I've recently curated an exhibition at the Barber Institute called Bellows and the Body that looks at the ways in which George Bellows approached ideas like the study of the nude and study from life models. So that's a kind of a focus on what I try to do. I work in a department that's focused primarily on the study of literature, and I come to that exploration of visual art and visual artists from a kind of literary perspective. But the focus has been for some time now on visual representation generally.